Great. Well, then I will get started. As Jenna mentioned, my name is Michaela Blackham, and I'm the Accessibility and QA Specialist here at Atten Design Group. As of 2020, I moved into a full accessibility specialist role here at Atten to really make a difference in our process, build a partnership with the Blind Institute of Technology, as well as educate others on the importance of creating accessible products and services. But don't cut me short, I also have years of experience as a front-end developer, as well as an interactive designer, all of which had a major focus on web accessibility. But let's kind of jump into it. I usually get this question about how did I get involved with such a specific area of focus so early on? And that's because I grew up with a cousin my age with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and watched how she was able to do her homework, navigate the internet, or even just listen to music on her iPod, all with little to no mobility or difficulty speaking loud enough for talk-to-type programs like Dragon or Siri. Sometimes she had to get very creative, but most of the time she had to ask for help, which I know frustrated her immensely. And I always wanted to relieve her of that stress. So I got involved with both physical and digital accessibility, but really focusing on the accessibility of your site is important in order to relieve the stress of everyone using your site, not just people who may struggle with it a bit more like M. And that's why we're here today to do a little Accessibility 101. But before we really dive into that, I just want to kind of gauge everyone's level of knowledge regarding this topic. So Jen is going to throw up a poll there so we can just see if everyone really is a beginner, maybe intermediate, maybe you know more than I do and you can help me out. Today's webinar is definitely more geared towards absolute beginners, but at the end, when we open it up for questions, I'll definitely take any level of question from you. So if you do have something pressing, I'm obviously here to help in any way. Awesome. So it looks like most people are beginners and intermediate, so this will be great. Hopefully none of this is too much for you guys when you're from the intermediate level, but like I said, if you have more specific questions later on, we can absolutely get to those. So let's kind of start off with what the problem is, like why are we here today? And that's really because people are glued to their phones, computers, tablets, and the wealth of knowledge and information at their fingertips. If you wanted to go to a movie, how would you find out what time it's playing? Or if you were in a new city and wanted to go out to eat, how would you find somewhere that you actually like? The internet is the main source of information for pretty much everyone nowadays. So, and according to the CDC, 61 million adults in the US live with some form of a disability. That was as of 2020. That means that's about 1 in 4 adults, or 1 in 4 potential users who may be interacting with your site. And even more surprising is that this statistic doesn't even include the number of internet and smartphone obsessed children in the country, many of whom may qualify as disabled as well. So how do people who are blind or have low vision get the same information? What about people with a lack of mobility for mouse control or touchscreen gestures? These questions are why there has been such a major push for more accessible products. So let's kind of dive in. Let's really think about it. What is digital accessibility? Like, what is this whole program that we're talking about? Well, digital or web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And this is really great. Obviously, we want to implement this and make this equal for everyone. It's a great idea in theory, but really, how do we actually follow and implement this into your website and into a normal practice? Well, creating accessible technology means following the principle of POUR. This is what actually your international guidelines are based on and grouped by. So when I talk about the principle of POUR, I'm talking about that your website needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So let's talk about this one first. Let's talk about making your website perceivable. This means that you need to make sure that users must be able to process any and all information that you have on your website. This means providing text for those who cannot hear and audio for those who cannot see, for example. Next is operable. This is really important because obviously we need everyone to be able to operate websites and applications with a variety of tools. Many users with disabilities cannot operate a mouse. Keyboard and screen reader controls must be present and must be functional. Now, this one's probably the most important one of all of them, and it's because if users can perceive and operate a website, That does not mean that they can actually understand it. Understandable websites use clear, concise language and offer functionality that is easy to comprehend. If accessibility is starting to feel a little more like usability, that's because usable websites are inherently more accessible. And finally, robust. Your product should work across all platforms and all browsers on all types of devices. So I didn't want to go into too much there because we have a lot to cover today, but you may be thinking you understand a little bit more about the principle of poor. It obviously makes sense. We want people to perceive, operate, we want them to understand, we want it to work everywhere. But sometimes it's kind of difficult to understand how to implement these principles into your website. And that's where the international guidelines come into play. So when I'm referring to the guidelines, I'm referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, WCAG, however you want to say it, as well as the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So let's talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines first. And that's because these are actually the international guidelines for accessibility standards for the internet. This is all over the place. It's international, it's for desktops, laptops, tablets, and mobile devices. Whether it's websites or applications, these guidelines cover them all. Currently, we are on version 2.1, but we should be moving up to 2.2 by the end of 2022. And as mentioned, these guidelines are grouped by the principle of poor. So there are a number of guidelines and success criterion underneath perceivable, ones that are related to operable, understandable, and again, robust. There are no guidelines that are outside of that realm because that all poor is what kind of encapsulates all of accessible content. With the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there are 3 levels regarding the success criterion. So there are A, AA, and AAA. Now, A is kind of the baseline. This is something that every single website should already be following. It's probably something you're not even thinking too hard about. So a great example of this is like including alternative text for images and infographics. That is an A-level success criterion, and that is because that's just something that everyone should be including nowadays. The AAA is a little more intense and isn't necessary for every single website. A lot of them are actually based on like application based, so maybe touch screens or gesture controls, or maybe it's just a more thorough version of something like contrast, where there are 2 levels for that, where there's a AA and a AAA. And then when you go into AAA, it may not be as visually appealing, so it's kind of finding that balance. The one we should all be shooting for is AA. So that is actually what the Department of Justice would be basing everything off of if there was some kind of accessibility lawsuit coming to them. So AA is something we should all be striving for. Another important note is that everything is backwards compatible. So everything that's in version 2.1 right now will also be found in 2.2. Everything that was in 2.0 was also in 2.1 and will also be in 2.2. So as long as you're keeping up to date with the latest version, it will be very easy to implement any of the changes that may be necessary. And the good thing is some of these guidelines, you can absolutely use automated tools like Wave or Lighthouse or Axe or any of those types of tools for automated testing. However, it's important to remember that a majority of these guidelines actually follow human logic and actual user testing, and therefore require manual testing. There is no one solution for a digital accessibility, unfortunately, and manual testing is always needed to be involved in order to be fully accessible. So now let's talk a little bit about the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So I get this one a lot because we do have a lot of federal agencies, governments, higher education that need to follow these guidelines. And really, I want to talk about this because really it's a federal law which requires programs and activities funded by federal agencies to be accessible to people with disabilities, including federal employees and members of the public. What people tend to get confused about with this is that they think these are completely separate guidelines from WCAG. From Web Content Accessibility Guidelines when it comes to your website. And yes, this section of the Rehabilitation Act covers more than just your site, including things like accessible PDFs, career opportunities, and so on. But the relevant part of this regarding websites and applications just points to WCAG 2.0 as the guidelines to follow. Because as mentioned, WCAG is the international standard. So if you're following the WCAG standards, you should be in good standing. There are a couple other slight differences that you can kind of get away with Section 508. However, it's not anything that we need to worry about today. I think as long as you're following WCAG, you should be in good standing. But if you are interested and you want to work with Atten, we can help you with no matter what your situation is. Or if you really just want more clarity on the difference, we can always talk about that at a later time. Overall, no matter which guideline or act you need to follow, always remember that that the digital accessibility is more than a checklist. That is the most important part to remember. So here's an example. So we have a small checklist here. You can see like, great, I have included alternative text for all of my images. Check, we're good to go there. I have a skip to main content link at the top of my page. Great, that works. We're good to go. And we included captions on our videos because we're using YouTube and we have the automated captions. Great, that works. But however, when your team is only focusing on the technical aspects of accessibility or something like this checklist, then the human interaction aspect is often lost and accessibility is not actually achieved. For instance, when we talk about alternative text for images, we need to double check, is the alternative text accurate? Does it convey the content of the image within the context of why it's being used? Is it short? Is it succinct? Does it actually make sense? Including alternative text that just says image number 24 or in something like that is not helpful. It's not actually conveying the purpose of the image there. Next is the skip to main content link. The most important thing you need to remember is to actually check to make sure that these things are functional. There are so many times that I'll take a look at skip to main content link and I'll interact with it with my keyboard and visually it looks like I jumped down on the page. But once I hit tab again, I'm still actually at the top of the page. So you need to make sure that you're actually checking your work via keyboard and manual testing. And another great one are the captions on videos. You need to make sure that they're accurate and correct. And I know that we're using something like that today where we're using automated captions to be able to interact and make sure we're there. And I've been told by a number of people that obviously having automated captions is way better than not having any captions at all. So you want to start with that. The great thing with what we're using with Zoom, you can actually download the transcript and you can update it to make it more accurate. And it becomes a lot easier to use in the long run. So that's just something you need to think about when you're having captions on videos, that you should be updating those where possible. And remember that we have the guidelines and yes, we should be like using as a checklist. You do still want to use it as something as like a reminder, but the basis of the guidelines is under the principle of POUR. And as mentioned, the most important part of the principle of POUR is to be understandable and usable. So just make sure you're making it understandable and usable. So now that we kind of went over the guidelines and what we're kind of talking about today, let's talk about who actually needs an accessible website. I know when I first started thinking about accessible websites, my mind immediately went to someone who needs to use a screen reader, and that's with a family member with a physical disability. But really, everyone actually benefits from an accessible website. There may be some demographics we work extra hard to accommodate for, but in reality, creating a more accessible website creates a much better user experience for you and for me. But like many others, I fell into the usual groupings. Everyone tends to start off and think that accessible websites are just for blind users, but it can actually be broken down into 4 main categories. So when I talk about who we're making these for, it could be those with visual impairments. It could be motor or physical impairments. It could be auditory impairments or those with cognitive impairments. So let's kind of dive into each one of these. So again, I bet when you hear visual impairments, you're probably still immediately going to someone who may be non-sighted, but there's a lot more to it. So when I talk about visual impairments, who am I talking about and like who does this actually affect? Now, this could be someone who is legally blind, or it could be someone with low, obstructed, or constricted vision. It could be someone like my father who's colorblind, or any one of our aging grandparents. Now, when I first heard low or poor vision, I just assumed blurry eyesight or losing one sight completely or something of that sort. But I didn't think about people who suffer from like constant tunnel vision or that constricted vision as example. So let's go through a couple of examples here. So here's a great example of how the checklist, there's more to it than the checklist. So if we're looking at this, we can see that this actually wouldn't cause any issues in any automated tooling because each one of these inputs has an associated label. The issue comes into the manual review here. So you can see, yes, we can see search has an input on that side, email has an input, URL has an input, we're good to go. However, what if someone has constricted vision and we have all that white space to deal with? So I have this little video here using a simulator called Funkify on Chrome. It's an extension. It's great for experiencing a number of issues. But as you can see here with constricted vision, all that white space can be kind of deterring. So we're on telephone. Now we don't know which input it is. Obviously, we have a little bit of leeway here because we already have the input in there, the text in there, but you can see it causes a bit of confusion. It can be very difficult for some users if that space is too wide. So something like this is obviously a better solution. However, now we're creating more problems. So now we, instead of the white space being between the label and the input, now the white space is on the left-hand side. And as we all know, at least in the US, we're reading from left to right. And if you're not having that exact line to start from, it can be very confusing for users to actually read. So ideally, we would want to do something like this. So we always have the label with the input. We have enough space between the input and the next grouping there so that we have that spacing to actually give that cognitive piece there. And that way there's no issues regarding any visual impairments. Next, I also want to talk about color blindness. So this is a great example of why we need to use more than just color to dictate any kind of changes in content. So here, if we were to look at this content here, and I asked you which of these words are links on the page, my guess is that you would probably immediately say React and high charts because it's underlined. But really, it's actually Health System Data Center, Drupal 8, React, high charts, because those are blue. That's what the designer chose, was that links were going to be blue. But again, what if you're colorblind? It's going to be a little difficult to deal with. So here's a version of color blindness that kind of gets rid of a little bit of the blue. And as you can see here, maybe you can see a difference, but some people can't actually see that difference at all. And they're going to still assume that React and high charts is that link there. So ideally, whenever you're dealing with color, you have to make sure it's passing contrast, but also that there is another form of information there that's going to kind of dictate what that interaction is. So links are just assuming that there's going to have an underline. So you want to make sure that you use this tried and true method. Don't try to kind of make it a little more interesting. You want to make sure it stands out from the rest of the content there. So when we're talking about visual impairments and you're looking at your own site, these are types of questions you should be asking yourself when kind of trying to figure out if things are looking okay. You need to ask yourself, how does the user navigate the page when a mouse just isn't an option? Or how does one get the information from an image or infographic if they can't see the image? Or how do you create an understanding of where the user is within the content without the help of visual cues? And obviously, is there enough contrast and color for the user to read and understand the content? Or is the typography choice easy to read at this font size, line length, or line height? What about in this color? And finally, does a user have to strain their eyes or move their head from side to side to relate labels to its input, like the example I showed you with the constricted vision? Now, this is solved in a bunch of different ways, but a big part of it is actually solved with great architecture and great design. Having that knowledge there is a great start. And then obviously keyboard navigation. If you can't see where your cursor is, then why would you be using a mouse? Keyboard navigation enables the user to still explore your site. And sound, obviously, with screen readers, it enables you to get the information that you're looking for through sound alone. So next, let's talk about motor or physical impairments. As mentioned, this is something that's incredibly dear to me, and this is what got me thinking more and more about accessibility to begin with. This is also something that can be very relatable in some instances. So for example, when I'm talking about motor or physical impairments, this could be someone like my cousin Emily with a disability from birth. It could be a wounded vet that uses prosthetics. It could be someone that suffers from tremors or uncontrollable arm or hand movements. Or honestly, it could even be my niece with a broken arm. It's funny because when people today tend to think about something physical interfering with using a computer or a touchscreen device, a lot of people just completely discount the users who are temporarily disabled. And this can truly affect any one of us at any time, whether it is something like an injured limb or just our aging bodies. So what types of things should you be looking for on your website when you're thinking about motor or physical impairments? You need to ask yourself, does your product require elaborate touch gestures or multiple finger interactions? What about quick double taps? That's a huge one I see a lot. Is the content easy to reach and interact with on this device? So think about mobile phones. How does one navigate and interact with a page when physical movement is difficult or completely non-existent? And will my user accidentally click another link or button because of the size or location of this interactive item? Now, this is something, like I said, we can relate to really any one of us. Does anyone remember the issues when larger smartphones came out? Maybe this is kind of a little older now, but I remember when they first came out and it was so difficult to deal with because you had that button at the bottom and then your thumb is always at the bottom of your phone. And then you had to get all the way up to the top right just to go somewhere. And there's like a lot of movement, a lot of physical reach and kind of like fumbling of your phone. So then they came up with the idea of doing the double tap on the button to bring everything down. But again, the double tap just gets rid of a large portion of the population that can't quite get that movement in there. So we were causing other issues while solving other ones. So it's just one of those things that we need to just pay attention to, that kind of reach of what's going on. The fun thing to think about nowadays is a lot of people have those pop sockets or things on the back of their phone that they hold on to that actually help everybody with that reach. But if you think about it, that's actually an assistive device for everybody. It's just not something you think about in that way because you're using it every day. But honestly, it's helping everyone and not just those who may be having a more tough time with physical reach. I'm also from New England. I'm from the Boston area and I've dealt with the cold. I don't know how many people are dealing with all of that right now, but I remember even just being younger, being at the the bus stop, and yes, this was before phones, so I had like my iPod Touch or my iPod, and having to do any kind of like double taps or having to move stuff around when I'm not wearing gloves because I think I'm too cool to be at the bus stop with gloves and a thick jacket on, and my fingers are so cold that they can't quite make those movements. So that could deal with us any day now, especially if you have like maybe some children who play football in like the late season and things like that. It could be very difficult to be able to record something of them while they're on the field because it's too cold and your hands can't quite move the way you want them to. Or like I like to talk about is I'll say like my fat thumbs, because I'll always be like, I'm awful with typos. So I'm writing on everything. And then all of a sudden everything is spelt wrong because I'm always clicking the wrong buttons. And that has to do with touch size and target size. So this is solved in a number of ways. And again, great UX is kind of the start of it all. UX must be involved and knowledgeable of UX practices and accessibility best practices. Keyboard navigation is a must for users who do not have that large range of motion. Even I'm a huge fan of keyboard navigation and keyboard shortcuts. Any chance to avoid the mouse, the better, because I tend to be quicker that way. But for those that require it, this is very important. And in some instances, touch keyboards are even easier to use because you don't have to put as much pressure on there. And a huge reminder that like not everyone that uses a screen reader uses it due to visual impairments. Many users rely on screen readers for navigation since it gives way more flexibility to how you can interact with the page than just the keyboard alone. And then obviously speech programs like Dragon or Siri. And there's honestly a lot of creative ways to solve this issue. So like eye trackers, so it will kind of follow where you are on the page, and you can even, like has a grid system and you can kind of narrow it down. They have these tongue sensitivity clickers where basically your tongue is like your fingers, and then you have a trackpad that you're kind of moving through, and there's like a whole bunch of options there. So they're getting really creative with how they can solve these issues. So I did want to touch upon the target size because this is something I see all the time in design. So according to WCAG standards, the minimum size an interactive item must be is 44 pixels by 44 pixels. Here, Google Material Design Guidelines is recommending 48, and honestly, that's better if that's what we're going to go for. But remember, 44 by 44 is the minimum for WCAG. So you can see here in example 1, the image itself, I'm assuming a profile image, is 48 by 48 pixels. So that is passing all the guidelines, easy to interact with. And you can see that little pink box around it. That's a little bit of padding to just give it a little more breathing space. Now, the second one is what I see a lot, where the icons are much smaller than 44 pixels by 44 pixels. Now, there's nothing wrong with the icon being so small. However, the target size of where you can actually interact with it must still be that 44 by 44. So you can see that this is including that extra padding, which actually makes it the correct size. And then this third option with the button, it's kind of a take on it, because if you think about 44 by 44, whatever that math is, the area of that, this is probably reaching that or surpassing it. However, the height of it is still less than 44. So we want to make sure that we're still including that target size of 44 pixels by including a little bit of that padding on the top and bottom. So I did want to show you, this is what I see a lot of times in design. So we'll go on the right side first. That a designer might see, okay, on mobile, we can still fit all of these things in the mobile header or the mobile footer, and there's plenty of space. We can put it all in there. Things are just going to be a little small. But how horrible would it be if you're working with something and you go to click on the plus sign to add a note, and then you're automatically deleting the note that you're working on? So those are two horrible things. That's a bad thing you don't want to have to mix up. So something of the sort on the left is kind of more of the direction you would go in, where you have plenty of space. There's no interactive pieces that might be clicked in accidentally. And that's always the main goal that we want to work with, because this isn't just for touch. Think about those who may have a tremor, that this is on a website and they're trying to use a mouse because they want to use a mouse. You want to make sure that they still have that little bit of breathing room in order to interact with that item. And I did want to show an example of the keyboard navigation for those who have never actually used it before. So this is great. We're just using the Atten website, but you can see this is Chrome, and you can see I'm keyboarding, I'm tabbing through, and you can see exactly where we are on the page because it's using the browser default for focus styles. Browser defaults are important to use with WCAG because we can, it doesn't actually, you don't have to worry about contrast guidelines, but also people who need to use a keyboard can have proprietary software that can change it to be more relevant for them. So if they need it to be wide, or like bigger, maybe bolder, maybe a different color, they have that ability to change it. Next is auditory impairments. And this is especially important in the educational world. A few years ago, might have been a while back now, but some major colleges and universities have actually been sued due to including free video material online. They're thinking they're doing something great and they're including all of this research and everything, but didn't have any form of captions or transcripts available. And especially nowadays where everything's so virtual, you want to make sure that you're including any kind of like I said, even if it is the automated captions, that's kind of the first route that you want to go in and then go from there. So when I talk about auditory impairments, I'm talking about someone who is hard of hearing or completely non-hearing, or it could be my grandfather who wears a hearing aid. Now, when we talk about things we need to look for, I'm sure you already know this, but when you're thinking auditory, you want to make sure you're looking for any embedded videos or audio files that you may have on your site. How do you get this information without physically listening to them? And your contact information. Can a user contact your business in another way besides just phone calls? You want to make sure that email and phone calls are always the option, because some people just work better with other directions there. So how is this solved? Well, obviously captions and transcripts. We want to provide descriptions about what is happening in a video embedded on the page, whether live captioning, downloading a transcript, or having audio descriptions. We always want to have some alternative form of communication. So always including email, or maybe even adding in an instant chat, only if it's accessible, of course, to your site is a great way to do that. And just remember, like, this is something that affects all of us. I don't know about you guys, but I actually like captions on my TV. And I'm sure some of you guys do as well, because like, who has time to try to hear and turn up the TV that loud when you're munching on snacks and you're eating a little too loud? Or for example, a lot of people like this in school because they can download the transcript and highlight as they follow along with the video. So it actually helps them learn a little bit better. A great thing with YouTube and transcripts, I'm sure Vimeo does it as well. I'm sure a bunch of them do, but if you have your transcript available on YouTube, you can actually search the transcript for what you're looking for in that video. So for instance, if we were searching the transcript for alternative communication, it would bring us to this timestamp, and then you can actually click on it and it will jump straight to this part of the website or the part of the video so that you can actually move along. It's great and really super helpful. And let's be real, kids don't like to be on the phone nowadays. A lot of people don't. So preferring texting, email, or chatting, and making sure you're just accommodating for everyone. And finally, let's talk about cognitive impairments. So when I talk about cognitive impairments, I'm talking about someone you may know who has Down syndrome, for example, or maybe it's the little boy I babysit with autism, or maybe your brother or sister with ADHD. This could also be your friend or colleague who may be dyslexic, or it could be someone like myself with extreme motion sickness. Now, this one isn't something I can easily relate to others, but the extreme motion sickness is probably the most interesting to me because, well, it affects me and is fairly new in the last few years. This is something in the last like 5-10 years that people are finally becoming more and more aware of after years of the military actually bringing these issues up with flight simulators. So if you think about pilots that are doing all these crazy tricks in their planes in the sky, but you put them in a flight simulator and then they're always getting sick, there had to be something that was going on. So that was something that people started to actually really think about. So what types of things should you be looking for when thinking about cognitive impairments? You want to ask yourself, are there too many colors, moving items, and images distracting the user or not enabling them to comprehend this content easily? Are there a lot of gestures a user will need to memorize just to interact with your application? Is there a clear direction and layout to guide a user through the content? Does the user have control over that video, or is it on autoplay? The autoplay one is a very important one that we can talk about in a moment. Fonts are super important. Does the font work for users who are sensitive to particular typefaces? And is there too much movement as a user scrolls down the page? So for instance, when I talked about fonts, you may be asking why that one came up, and I do have a fun fact for you. So Comic Sans is something we always make fun of and something we should never ever use in a design sense. However, it has been proven to work really well for those who have dyslexia. It becomes very easy to read. There are other similar fonts out there. OpenSlexia is another one I see pretty often, and I've seen on other websites where you actually have the ability to change the font that you're looking at so that it can be a little bit easier for those to read. And then I did talk about excessive movements. So when I'm talking about excessive movements, I'm talking about like parallax websites. We don't see them as much anymore, but sometimes if there's too much parallax and too many things going on at once, it can make people like myself pretty ill. Or maybe someone decided to change the scrolling speed of the mouse, and then that's kind of throwing everybody off. So it gets a little funky there. So here's a great example of distracting content and visual density. It's a little over the top, and this website has been updated. It's still not great, but this is the older one and I always loved it. So you can see here, it's super distracting. There's so much going on. You don't know what to look at. You don't actually know what's going on here. And it's always super confusing. So I always like to show this. This is obviously over the top, but really it's just a way to show you that hierarchy and white space will always be your friend. So how are things like this solved? Well, we've grown up our entire lives to make everything as simple as possible. So why not do it for our sites as well? Unnecessary complexity should be avoided. Just remember to keep it simple, silly. And clear and consistent layouts, keeping everything streamlined, simple, and consistent. We should be able to easily guide a user through our content on our pages. Smart color palettes. So people have laughed at me in the past when I told them I've taken entire classes on color theory, but this is an instance where it becomes incredibly important to have this knowledge. We need to stay away from awful color palettes that are distracting or cause eye strain. Controllable interactions. This is what I was talking about, the autoplay. Animations in media should always be controllable. It's a WCAG guideline. And time limits for completing an action should be generous and configurable. If you have videos on autoplay, it needs to be able to have controls to turn that off. If you have a ton of animations on the page, you must be able to turn those animations off or turn them down. You want people to control that interaction rather than being forced into it. And finally, subtle movements are important. And don't forget that too much movement will actually make me nauseous. So please stay away from any excessive movements on the page if you don't need to. Just remember that a little can go a long way. So now that we've kind of gone through everything that's going on here, we know about what it is, what guidelines we're doing, and who we're making these for. I know you're probably going to say like, but wait, we just went through all of this. And why did we have to go through all of it? Because I know about these amazing accessibility plugins and these overlays that I've seen out there. Shouldn't that fix all your issues and save you from any legal downfalls? I get this question a lot nowadays. A client or a developer has heard about a new accessibility plugin that will solve all of your problems in little to no money upfront. They use artificial intelligence to fix your entire website of all errors, and it adds a plugin to customize your user's experience. It doesn't require anyone going into your code and fixing anything, that it's just a little JavaScript line and it fixes everything on your site so it's compliant. Sounds amazing, right? For those that don't know what I'm referring to, here's an example. We don't use one of these, obviously, but we have, I just put the icon on the bottom right. You can see the little arrow pointing to it. So usually they look something like this. They could be on the top in any of the corners usually, but here's a great example. You would click on that and it gives you more options than any person will ever need to adjust their website to best fit their needs. So you can see there's like a seizure safe profile. There's an ADH friendly profile. Something with a screen reader, there's readable fonts, you can highlight links, and there's more and more content to actually play around with on here. And it's just a little overwhelming. And honestly, I feel like we've all learned this the hard way in the past, but in this case, obviously, if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. And in this case, unfortunately, it is too good to be true. I know it probably has the right intentions, and honestly, people are just really scared about being sued regarding accessibility. So they're obviously adding whatever they can to the site, but understanding the true meaning of digital accessibility, what it entails, getting a review, and implementing changes to improve your site can happen just a little bit at a time. So don't fall for these get accessible quick schemes. Make sure you include your accessibility statement on your site, even if it reflects the fact that your site isn't accessible, and start making those little changes that you need to. But anyways, let's just go into what the issues are with this. There are a number of issues, as I mentioned, with the overlays, but here's a quick review of some of the more important ones. A majority of the guidelines, as we mentioned before, cannot be fixed or detected with automated tools alone. That would be amazing if that was the case. However, artificial intelligence is not quite there. It has to be detected and used by humans in order to realize if it's accessible or not. And honestly, you saw there was like a screen reader option, for example, or like it helps with keyboard, but really these people are going to use their own proprietary software. They're not going to waste all those years of learning JAWS or VoiceOver or NVDA just to use this new one that only kind of works sometimes on this one website. So it's kind of just a waste on that side. And you need to customize your experience before you can even interact with the site. So imagine coming to the site, realizing there might be something going on. You have to look through the entire site, find out what's wrong, then make those adjustments to then see if that helps and this and that. And I find that it's just more able users who are having more interactions with these than people who actually would rely on them. Another big part is that there are a ton of these plugins out there. There's definitely a couple more that are more well-known. I see someone in the chat mentioned Userway, there's Accessibility. Those are kind of the two really big ones out there, but there are plenty of others as well. And every single one is different. And then every single one of them includes a new learning curve. So imagine having to actually rely on this and go to a website and you made everything perfect. And then you go to a new website and now you have to then customize your experience with a new one and for this new site and everything, and nothing ever like really transfers over. So it's very difficult to work with. And from a screen reader perspective, it actually takes focus away from screen readers if it's the first thing on the page, where it will just ping them over and over again, so that the screen reader user might actually be navigating the site perfectly fine. And then all of a sudden focus is taken away. It's brought back to the plugin saying, hey, use me. And it's like, no, I don't want to use you. I'm using my own thing. So that's kind of annoying frustration that I've heard from screen reader users. There are too many options and customizations. I know I've been to like the Cheesecake Factory once in my life because their menu is way too large and there's too many options and I'm overwhelmed and then I don't know what I'm getting and I like land with chicken fingers and honey mustard. Like I would prefer to get something good. So by having too many options and customizations isn't always a good thing. And finally, this is probably one of the most important ones, but many users who actually require assistive technology have their JavaScript turned off. And if your JavaScript is turned off, then this plugin doesn't work and now your site is inaccessible again. And honestly, I've mentioned we're partnered with the Blind Institute of Technology for screen reader testing here at Atten. We've had lengthy discussions with their team. My favorite quote from all of this is from an actual screen reader user. And he says that website overlays hijack the user experience, attempting to display the site in a way it thinks is helpful to me. Many overlays sit at the top of the page and continuously send audio announcements to the screen reader, asking the user to engage the tool. These alerts constantly interrupt the audio when the web page is being read. As you can see, this is from Mike Hess. He's the founder and executive director of the Blind Institute of Technology, and it's actually creating more harm than good for him. It may deter some lawyers for now, but we're actually starting to see that these lawyers are actually using it as a target for many to file accessibility lawsuits. The main issue, it doesn't actually change the structure of your site. If the code isn't changed, then your site is still inaccessible. If you want to use one of these as an extension of your accessible website, then by all means, of course, but in using it to just solve all your issues is definitely not the direction to go in. And as you can see from Mike here, overlays trick product teams into thinking accessibility can be solved and put out of mind with just a few clicks. There is no substitute for making digital accessibility an embedded part of team culture. And the first step of embedding the idea of accessible user experience onto your team is joining us today for this just beginner course on like what's going on. There's a lot that you can do with little knowledge of accessibility and just kind of jumping in and making even content changes. So hopefully today the webinar will empower you to start your accessibility journey. Now, this is a topic I can talk about for hours, maybe days, maybe weeks, who knows, but I've done a number of other recorded webinars, and these ones seem to be the most relevant to what we were talking about today, especially from the beginner intermediate side. But I do have some links here. As you can see, we have some short links, and don't worry about jumping and grabbing these too quickly. I know that Jen is going to be sending this with the recap email with some resources, so you'll have access to them there. But we do have a creating accessible website content webinar, and that one's really great because that's no dev knowledge. That is just making sure your content is accessible, because that's where I actually find most issues on the site are from content. We also have one that's a little more in depth regarding performing accessibility review on your site. So this goes over automated testing tools such as Wave, Lighthouse, Axe, etc., as well as jumping in with keyboard controls and overall visual manual testing. It doesn't really touch upon screen reader controls, only because at Atten we believe users who rely on screen readers should be the ones actually testing, because they experience it a bit different than obviously I would. We have a Q&A with Atten and BIT, which was a wonderful one. So it's just an open discussion and people asking Mike mostly questions about accessibility in his life as a screen reader user, as well as an approach to accessible web projects, which is another similar 101. However, it goes into a little bit more in depth about how you can make changes and make everything a little bit easier there. So